This house once helped decide the fate of nations, yet it was never truly safe. This is Waddesdon Manor, a French-style palace on English soil, not built for a king, but for a banking family. People come here to admire the beauty. They don't see the deals that were never written down, or the guests who never appeared in official records. There have always been whispers that more was decided inside this house, before Parliament ever spoke. This is not a story about wealth. It is a story about the fear behind old money. Because when you need to build a palace, to prove that you belong, you are never truly secure. To understand why this house was built, we have to go back in time, to the fear that shaped it from the very beginning. The same rooms, a different world. November 1940. Buckinghamshire, England. The rooms are still here, but the world around them has changed. The lights are completely out. Heavy blackout curtains seal every window. Glass panes are crossed with strips of tape, a crude measure meant to limit shattering if bombs strike nearby. There are no guests. No evening receptions beneath crystal chandeliers. No music. No dinners. No voices carrying through the halls. Waddesdon Manor is almost empty. Outside, searchlights sweep the Buckinghamshire sky. German bombers are hitting London, less than 60 kilometers away. The same rooms remain, but the purpose of the house has shifted entirely. Beneath the mansion, behind thick doors and reinforced spaces, large wooden crates are stacked carefully in the basement. They do not contain gold. They do not contain cash. They do not contain classified government documents. They contain paintings. Hundreds of works from the National Gallery in London have been evacuated from the capital, as museums are no longer considered secure. Rembrandt, Gainsborough, Reynolds. These names represent more than art. They represent national heritage. Today, a single major Rembrandt can exceed $100 million on the open market. But in 1940, their value is not measured in money. They carry memory, identity, and cultural continuity. And at this moment, all of it is hidden. Inside the basement of a private estate, Waddesdon Manor was built by a Jewish family. At the same time, across continental Europe, Jews are being systematically stripped of property, pushed out of professions, excluded from public life, and increasingly targeted for elimination. In Germany and Austria, Jewish homes are seized. Businesses are forced to close. Families are driven from society and then from existence itself. And yet, here in England, a Jewish-built mansion is quietly protecting the most valuable cultural assets of the British nation. There are no public announcements, no speeches, no symbolic gestures, only a silent, uncomfortable reality. After the war, fragments of correspondence and private recollections hint at a detail never formally recorded. Some wartime officials are said to have admitted in private that they trusted Waddesdon Manor more than certain government vaults. There is no official transcript of such statements, no public confirmation. But the context makes the whisper plausible. Waddesdon lies far from industrial centers. It is not a military target. Its structure is solid. Its rooms reinforced, and it is overseen by a family long experienced in protecting assets across borders. That trust was never declared. It was expressed through action. More crates continued to arrive. The question is not why Britain sent its paintings here. The question is, why a family, so often described as foreign, became the guardian of the nation's cultural core at its most vulnerable moment. At this point, Waddesdon Manor is no longer a social stage. It has become a fortress, but that still does not explain why this house was built. From the beginning, in a way capable of absorbing a crisis like this, to understand that, the story must move further back in time, to a moment when the fear did not come from bombs, but from something quieter, the uncertainty of never knowing whether belonging was truly secure. The man behind the house. To understand why Waddesdon Manor was built the way it was, the story has to narrow. From financial empires stretching across Europe, from wars and nations, down to a single man. His name was Ferdinand de Rothschild. He was born in 1839 in Paris into a family that by the mid-19th century had already become a financial pillar of Europe. By the time Ferdinand was born, the Rothschild network operated in 5 major capitals: London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, and Naples. These were not independent branches. They functioned as a single system, bound by blood ties, encrypted correspondence, and a private courier network, faster than most government diplomatic channels. The family did not simply lend money. They underwrote government bonds, arranged war loans, and financed strategic infrastructure, such as railways, canals, and ports. In the first half of the 19th century alone, Rothschild arranged deals, worth hundreds of millions of pounds at the time. Adjusted for modern purchasing power, these figures translate into trillions of US dollars. To put that into perspective, a single Rothschild loan to a European government would be comparable today to a full-scale national bailout managed by global financial institutions. This scale made the family indispensable to governments. It also made them deeply unsettling to society. A family not fully tied to one flag. Not loyal to a single nation. Moving capital, information, and influence across borders. In a world where most people never left the place they were born, for state power, this was an advantage. For the public, it was a source of anxiety. And Ferdinand grew up inside that enormous shadow. But Ferdinand was not prepared to lead this empire. From childhood, he was considered fragile, physically weak, frequently ill, unsuited to the relentless pressure of international finance. Private doctors were hired, costly treatments were attempted, and whenever his health declined, Ferdinand was removed from the center of power. In a dynasty where endurance, control, and tolerance for pressure were survival requirements, weakness was not a personality trait, it was a liability. Ferdinand grew up acutely aware that his place within the family was always conditional. For health reasons, he was sent to England as a young man, officially for recovery. In practice, it also placed him outside the core machinery of the empire. In England, Ferdinand did not run the bank. He did not manage daily operations. He did not carry responsibility for decisions that shaped nations. He existed in a gap, and inside that gap, his private life took center stage. Ferdinand married Evelina, his cousin. Such marriages were not uncommon among the Rothschilds, designed to keep wealth and information within the family. But surviving letters suggest this was more than a financial arrangement. 18 months after their wedding, Evelina died in childbirth. The baby did not survive. The historical record grows quiet here. There are no public diaries, no personal statements, but Ferdinand's choices afterward reveal the scale of the loss. After Evelina's death, Ferdinand withdrew from direct banking. He reduced his involvement in Vienna and Frankfurt. He chose to remain in England, and he began to collect. Not casually, he collected paintings, porcelain, furniture, manuscripts, objects that could be classified, arranged, and controlled. Unlike people, these objects did not leave. They did not betray. They did not disappear without warning. By his early 30s, Ferdinand's collection had grown so vast that his London house could no longer contain it. Corridors became storage. Staircases narrowed with crates. Rooms meant for living turned into archives. This was no longer a gentleman's hobby. It had become a system. But great collections cannot survive forever in improvised spaces. They require a proper setting, a place that forces visitors to acknowledge their importance. And more than that, they require a space where the owner no longer feels like a guest in someone else's world. The decision to build Waddesdon emerged from that need. It was not simply a new residence. It was a declaration in stone, an attempt to transform invisible financial power into physical presence. But this is where the story turns, because the way Ferdinand chose to prove that he belonged would expose exactly what he feared most. To understand why, we have to examine the architectural choice he was about to make and why it looked nothing like an English country house. Architecture as a declaration of power, but this is where the story turns. Because when Ferdinand de Rothschild decided to build an estate in England, he did not follow the path English aristocrats had used for centuries. He did not build a Georgian country house. He did not choose Palladian symmetry, long associated with English tradition. He did not invoke local lineage or ancestral land. Instead, he chose something entirely different. A French Renaissance chateau. In 1874, Ferdinand purchased roughly 2,700 acres of land in Buckinghamshire. At its center stood a bare, windswept hilltop, with no convenient access roads, and by the construction standards of the time, an almost irrational choice. Local residents believed he had chosen poorly. Engineers warned that transportation costs would be enormous. There was no railway reaching the summit. Every stone, timber beam, and iron component had to be hauled upward by human labor, horses, and steam engines. Surviving construction records indicate that earthworks and foundations alone cost the modern equivalent of tens of millions of pounds. Ferdinand did not reconsider, because that hilltop was not an engineering mistake. It was a symbolic decision. To realize his vision, Ferdinand hired Gabriel Hippolyte d'Estaing, a French architect known for restoring and designing Loire Valley-style chateaux. The decision attracted immediate attention. A Jewish financier, hiring a French architect, building a French palace, a don et tum on English soil. In the late 19th century, this was not neutral taste. It was a statement. The architectural style Ferdinand chose was historically tied to French noble families of the 16th century, families who built chateaux, to prove they deserved proximity to royal power. This was not defensive architecture. It was performative architecture. It said that the owner understood European culture deeply, understood art, history, and protocol, and possessed the resources to recreate all of it, anywhere he chose. In England, the message carried another layer. English aristocrats did not need to prove taste. They relied on bloodline. They relied on ancestral land. They relied on having been there first. Ferdinand had none of those advantages. And precisely because of that, he chose architecture as a resume. Construction began in earnest in 1877. The hill was reshaped. Massive retaining walls were erected. Steam engines operated continuously. Hundreds of laborers were employed. Stone was transported from Bath. Roofing slate arrived from Wales. Carvers were brought in from France. All of it served a single purpose: to create one image on the horizon. A chateau rising above the landscape. The approach road to Waddesdon was not designed for speed. It curves. Each turn was calculated to reveal the house in stages. Guests arriving by carriage did not see the entire structure at once. First the tower, then a wing, then the full facade opening into view. This was not transportation. It was theater. Inside, every element continued to serve the same goal. A. High ceilings, large French-style windows, far bigger than English standards of the time. Light carefully directed to illuminate paintings, porcelain, tapestries, and furniture. Waddesdon had electric lighting. When many English estates still relied on gas, it had central heating. It had hot running water in guest rooms. By late 19th century standards, this was extreme luxury. Ferdinand did not merely match the English aristocracy. He surpassed them in the very domains they prized. But this is where the social contradiction emerged. English aristocrats visited. They admired the craftsmanship. They praised the refinement. And then they left and described it as a foreign house. In satirical newspapers, caricatures appeared. Rothschild figures were drawn with exaggerated features, surrounded by money and palaces. The message was indirect but unmistakable. Money could buy stone, it could buy art, but it could not buy lineage. Ferdinand understood this, and he did not retreat. He escalated. By 1889, after 15 years of construction, Waddesdon Manor was complete. Modern estimates place the total cost at the equivalent of hundreds of millions of pounds today. This was no longer a house. It was a challenge. A question posed to British society: if taste was flawless, if financial power was undeniable, if royalty itself crossed this threshold, then what remained? To justify exclusion? That question did not receive an immediate answer. And just as Waddesdon reached its visual peak, something else began to take shape beneath it. A structure most guests never saw. And that is where the story turns darker. The world below. Whoa. But this is where the story begins to darken. Because a house like Waddesdon cannot function on art and light alone. Beneath the gilded ceilings, beneath the ballrooms and libraries, there existed another world. A world most guests were never meant to see. By the late 1882, when Waddesdon was fully operational, the house required more than 100 servants to function on a daily basis. This included the butler and under-butlers, chefs and kitchen staff, housemaids, footmen, bootboys, grooms, gardeners, and at the very bottom of the hierarchy, scullery maids and hallboys, many of them only 13 to 15 years old. These numbers were not unusual for a great estate, but at Waddesdon, the scale and degree of control were pushed to near absolute levels. The entire house was designed to keep the two worlds apart. Separate staircases for servants, hidden corridors running beneath the floors, service entrances completely detached from the routes used by the family and their guests. Even sound was carefully managed. A network of pull bells was installed throughout the principal rooms. Each room had its own signal. Servants could identify where they were needed by sound alone. No delay, no mistakes, no consider work in Topsin Jun, one setter working in Tinsha 7. No direct eye contact with guests, unless specifically instructed. A day at Waddesdon began at 4 in the morning. Fires were lit in the kitchens. Water was heated for the entire house. Stone floors were scrubbed before dawn. Breakfast appeared for guests, as if by instinct, but behind it stood dozens of hours of labor that were never acknowledged. According to surviving wage books, the head butler earned roughly £80 per year, including room and board. A housemaid earned between £25 and £30. A scullery maid earned as little as £12 per year. For comparison, a single painting purchased by Ferdinand in the same period cost more than the entire annual wage bill of the household staff. No one carved that into the walls. But the numbers remain. On the surface, the Rothschilds were considered better employers than many aristocratic families. There are no records suggesting systematic cruelty or physical abuse. But power at Waddesdon did not rely on violence. It relied on replaceability. A servant could be dismissed for a minor error, a poorly folded sheet, a smudge on a glass. Dismissal meant the loss of both income and housing, and without a reference, employment at another major house was nearly impossible. This was silent control. No threats required, no explanations offered, but this alone does not explain why the system mattered. What made it significant was that the people below stairs often knew more than those seated at the dinner table. They overheard fragments of conversation. They observed who arrived and who departed, visits that never appeared in guest books. Late-night discussions, when the library lights remained on and only a small circle of men stayed behind. Servants did not know details, but they recognized patterns, timing, and familiar faces. They understood that Promising O'Palin, Waddesdon was more than a weekend retreat. This is where the moral tension becomes visible. Waddesdon was built to project refinement, order, and control. Yet that perfection existed only because of a class forbidden from being seen. Old money does not operate through spectacle. It operates by erasing labor. The less visible the work, the more natural the luxury appears. And then, a disruption occurs. Not in the ballroom, not at the dining table, but below ground. In the late 1890 seconds, personnel records show a cluster of abrupt departures. It's no detailed explanations, only brief notations, such as terminated or left without reference. Some servants departed after years of service. Others vanish from the records entirely. There is no evidence of a public scandal. But the timing matters. These departures coincided with another shift. Gatherings at Waddesdon became more discreet, fewer invitations, smaller guest lists. Yet, the names that did appear carried greater weight. And this is where, the questions begin. If Waddesdon was merely a house, why was silence enforced so strictly? If it was only a social stage, why was information controlled so tightly? And if the servants knew more than they said, who was truly running this house? The answer does not lie entirely below stairs. It lies in what happened. It have to descender tapped her after the last bell rang, at the dinner table, after midnight. And that is where the story moves into another layer of power. When royalty crossed the gate, there was a moment when Waddesdon could no longer be dismissed as a private house. That moment came when the heir to the British throne crossed its gates and stayed the night. One of the most significant guests at Waddesdon was Edward W.I., then still Prince of Wales. In late 19th century Britain, this was not a routine social visit. By unwritten convention, the Prince of Wales did not stay overnight in houses whose owners were not considered part of the true governing elite. Edward's decision to stay at Waddesdon carried political meaning. It required no announcement, no official statement. Those who understood the rules understood the signal. The prince's presence fundamentally altered how Waddesdon was perceived. It was no longer seen merely as a lavish residence owned by financiers, no longer dismissed as a foreign house, as satirical papers had once labeled it. From that point on, Waddesdon became a space tacitly accepted by the monarchy. And that acceptance changed. Who followed? After Edward's visits, the character of Waddesdon's guest list shifted. Not larger in number, but heavier in political weight. Serving cabinet ministers, senior figures from the colonial office, high-ranking diplomats, handling matters not yet ready for public disclosure. They did not come for spectacle. They came because someone of ultimate authority had already crossed that threshold. These meetings left no formal record. There were no agendas, no minutes, no official secretaries. That absence did not make them harmless. In private memoirs and correspondence from the period, brief references appear without explanation. An evening in Buckinghamshire, a conversation after dinner, an understanding reached before any announcement. No details are provided. No direct claims are made. But when such phrases recur, shortly before major financial or political decisions, a pattern begins to form. From this pattern, a persistent rumor emerged. Never formally confirmed, never conclusively denied, that certain financial and political directions were softened at Waddesdon before entering official channels. That no decisions were signed there. 17H, but many decisions became easier after the right people had spoken privately. This was not an accusation. It was structural suspicion. The social contradiction became clear. Britain defined itself as a nation governed by parliament, procedure, and public accountability. Yet part of its influence appeared to operate in private spaces, beyond direct public scrutiny. Waddesdon held no official authority, but it could shape the atmosphere in which authority was exercised. This was what made the house sensitive, not because of anything proven, but because of what could not be documented, yet remained logically persuasive. Once royalty had crossed the gate, No conversation held there could remain merely private. From that point forward, Waddesdon attracted not only guests, but scrutiny. Satirical newspapers increased their focus on the Rothschild name. Caricatures began linking money, power, and private gatherings within a single frame. There was no scandal yet, but the terrain of suspicion had been prepared. And in a Europe moving steadily toward instability, spaces once considered neutral would soon be forced to take sides. When war arrived, ambiguous power would no longer be tolerated, and Waddesdon would no longer be allowed to remain just a house. When war no longer allowed neutrality, the turning point came in August 1914. Europe did not drift quietly into crisis. It fractured. Treaties collapsed. Borders closed. Financial networks that once operated across nations were suddenly severed by enemy lines. For families whose power depended on cross-border trust, this was not merely a political problem. It was a matter of survival. When the First World War began, the Rothschild family no longer functioned as a single unit. Its branches were embedded in opposing nations: London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt. Each branch was tied to a government that now regarded the others as enemies. The same family name appeared on both sides of the battlefield. But that alone did not capture the full danger. Modern war demanded enormous resources. The British government quickly faced expenditures exceeding hundreds of millions of pounds, a scale unprecedented at the time. To put this in perspective, before the war, Britain's annual government spending stood at roughly £200 million. Within months of fighting, that figure multiplied. War bonds had to be issued. Credit had to be stabilized. Markets had to be reassured. Financial confidence became a weapon of war. In this context, extraordinary attention fell on families with deep financial reach and extensive international networks. Waddesdon Manor, already associated with elite influence exercised behind closed doors, could no longer exist in ambiguity. A house once praised for discretion now invited suspicion. Where did its owners' loyalties lie? Whose interests did they truly serve? And could a family spanning enemy nations be trusted in wartime? Scrutiny intensified. In parliamentary debates, Waddesdon was not named directly, but the language shifted. Phrases such as foreign influence, international finance, and private networks beyond oversight appeared with increasing frequency. The target was rarely explicit. The implication was widely understood. At the same time, the Rothschilds were confronted with an impossible demand. They were expected to support national war efforts, while remaining connected to relatives across enemy lines. This was not merely a question of image. It was a moral and operational contradiction. Any movement of capital invited suspicion. Any silence risked accusation. And any attempt at neutrality was interpreted as disloyalty. This shift changed everything. By 1915, Waddesdon's role altered sharply. Large gatherings ended. Guest lists narrowed. Conversations once held in private became too dangerous to sustain. The house remained, but its function did not. Silence replaced influence. Behind closed doors, another tension emerged. Newspapers and political commentators began portraying international financiers not as stabilizing forces, but as potential threats. Caricatures and editorials drew sharper lines. Wealth without borders was no longer admired. It was feared. This was not a public scandal. There was no trial, no charges, no single moment of collapse, but it was a structural rupture. The world that had allowed Waddesdon to exist as a discrete center of influence had disappeared. In wartime, Britain, power was required to declare allegiance. Ambiguity became dangerous. Oh, when the war ended in 1918, Europe had been permanently altered. Empires fell, currencies weakened, old guarantees no longer held. Waddesdon survived physically, but the environment that had given it meaning was gone. The question was no longer, how much influence the house once held. The question became, what happens to old money when the systems that protected it collapse? When power was frozen? After 1918, Waddesdon did not collapse. It stood still. While Europe was moving at an unprecedented speed, this house entered a strange condition. Not decline, not confiscation, but removal from the flow of decision-making. The war that had just ended cost Britain more than £3 billion at the time. Adjusted to today's value, that figure equals over 200 billion US dollars. To manage this debt, the British government expanded its financial machinery on a scale never seen before. Throughout the 1,920 seconds, state budgets nearly doubled compared to the pre-war years. Power no longer lived where relationships were strongest. It lived where structures existed. Before 1914, a private conversation between financiers and politicians could shape national policy. After 1918, every major loan had to pass through the Treasury, the central banking system, and layers of formal oversight. There were no shortcuts anymore. The Rothschild family did not become poor. The London branch alone still controlled assets estimated in the tens of millions of pounds, equivalent to several $billion today. But money was no longer the decisive factor. The space where money could be converted into influence had disappeared. Waddesdon once functioned as an informal center of power. It hosted the Prince of Wales, later Edward VI, alongside ministers, diplomats, and financial figures from across Europe. But after the war, these figures no longer made decisions in private houses. They met in state offices, recorded minutes, signed documents, and left legal traces. One number captures this shift: between 1,920 and 1,930, the number of senior officials in the British Treasury increased by more than 60%. During the same period, the role of unofficial advisors declined sharply and virtually disappeared from decision-making structures. Waddesdon was not rejected, it was systematically bypassed. A new moral conflict emerged here. This house had been built to generate influence without holding formal office. But the post-war world increasingly viewed that very condition as a risk. Power without accountability was no longer acceptable, and a private mansion could not sign its name under national decisions. By the end of the 1,920 seconds, Waddesdon had completed its historical function. It was no longer a place where decisions were tested. It became a place where the memory of power was preserved. This story is not about collapse, it is about obsolescence. Old money did not lose because it became weaker. It lost because the world no longer needed the way it operated. When money lost its value, the palace became a burden. By the late 1,920 seconds, a new threat emerged. Not from politics, not from society, it came from the market. In October 1929, Wall Street collapsed. Within a matter of weeks, more than 30 billion US dollars in asset value disappeared. Adjusted to today's terms, that equals over 500 billion US dollars. This crisis did not remain in the United States. It spread across Europe through banking systems, credit networks, and international investments. For old financial dynasties, this was not a sudden shock. It was a slow financial hemorrhage. Asset values declined. Cash flow tightened. Long-term investments became locked and illiquid. And for the first time, large country houses were no longer symbols. They became dangerous fixed costs. Waddesdon Manor was among them. Maintaining a property of nearly 5,000 square meters with hundreds of rooms, a large staff, formal gardens, greenhouses, and conservation-level art maintenance cost tens of thousands of pounds per year, equivalent to several million US dollars today. In stable times, this was manageable. In a global depression, it became a survival question. A moral conflict emerged. Waddesdon had been built to demonstrate permanence. Now, It demanded a level of consumption, increasingly out of step with the society beyond its gates. While unemployment in Britain, it's not a good or heaven, rose above 20% in the early 1930 seconds, the upkeep of a lavish private palace began to attract a different kind of attention. Not hatred, but intolerance. This is where the story turns. The Rothschild family did not collapse, but they were forced to reassess their entire asset structure. What once represented strength now required reclassification. What generated value, what merely consumed it, and Waddesdon stood precisely on that line. An unannounced decision began taking shape in the early 1930 seconds. Not to sell immediately, not to close the house, but to confront a harder question. Could a mansion built to express power survive in a world that no longer accepted that form of power? And there was one more factor that made the calculation far more dangerous. Anti-Semitism was returning to Europe with a speed and intensity that could not be ignored. In Germany, economic collapse was being converted into political hatred. Large financial names began appearing in speeches and pamphlets. Rothschild was one of them. At this moment, Waddesdon was no longer just an expensive asset. It had become a high-visibility symbol, a vast house on a hill, a name tied to international finance, at a time when wealth was no longer admired, but suspected. The question was no longer whether Waddesdon should be kept. The question was how to keep it without turning it into a burden, financially, socially, and in terms of security. This was no longer an architectural story. It was a problem of survival. And this was still not the final secret, because only a few years later, another decision would completely redefine Waddesdon's fate, not driven by markets, not imposed by government, but by war. When the lights went out and power disappeared, September 1939, war breaks out across Europe, and within days, Waddesdon Manor enters a completely different state of existence. Not through an announcement, but through orders. All lights are switched off. Windows are covered with blackout curtains. Glass is taped in X shapes to reduce blast damage. A palace built to be seen is now forced to learn how to disappear. At this point, the head of the Rothschild family in Britain is James de Rothschild. He is not a collector like Ferdinand, not a builder of symbols. James is a practical man, and he understands one thing very clearly. In wartime, assets are no longer judged by beauty, but by risk. Waddesdon sits on a high hill, visible from a distance. In military terms, that makes it a recognition point. No one says this publicly, but early air defense assessments regularly flagged large, isolated structures as strategic liabilities. Then, a special request arrives. From the National Gallery in London, German bombs are falling on the capital. Museums are no longer safe. Thousands of national artworks need to be evacuated urgently. Among the locations considered, Waddesdon is selected, not because of prestige, but because of structure. Thick walls, large underground spaces, controlled access, distance from dense urban areas. By 1940, large wooden crates begin arriving in the basement. Inside are works by Rembrandt, Gainsborough, and Reynolds. Paintings that today would be valued at tens or even hundreds of millions of US dollars each. A social contradiction emerges here. A mansion, built by a Jewish family, is now protecting Britain's national cultural treasures. At the same moment, across Europe, Jewish people are being stripped of rights, pursued, and erased from public life. A rumor appears in wartime memoirs. Some officials privately admitted, Cezanne Act, they trusted Waddesdon more than government vaults. There is no official document confirming this, but the outcome is clear. 89, and that of Ein. When comments of you, those artworks survived the war, without damage. Meanwhile, the Rothschild family itself is far less protected than the paintings. In France, Rothschild properties are seized by the Nazis. In Austria and Germany, banking branches are shut down. Part of the art collection is stolen, including works later identified in the personal collection of Hermann Göring. At this point, Waddesdon is no longer a symbol of wealth. It becomes a paradox, a place preserving culture, while the people who built it are being pushed out of Europe. James de Rothschild serves in the British military throughout the war. His family publicly aligns with Britain, but none of this guarantees Waddesdon's future once the war ends. As the war draws to a close in 1945, the crates are opened. The paintings return to London. Waddesdon's mission is complete. But a larger question follows immediately. A house built to display power, then frozen by economics, then hidden by war. How does it exist in a post-war world that no longer tolerates that kind of power? When power no longer lives in a will? In 1945, the war in Europe ended. Waddesdon Manor was still standing. It had not been bombed. It had not been occupied. It had not collapsed into ruins like so many other great estates. But the greatest threat to Waddesdon no longer came from war, it came from the post-war world. To understand why, we need to step back. In 1898, Ferdinand de Rothschild died at the age of 58. He had no children. The man who built Waddesdon as a declaration of permanence left it behind without a direct heir. The house did not collapse at that moment. It passed to Alice de Rothschild, Ferdinand's younger sister. Alice did not expand the estate. She did not turn it into a new center of influence. For more than 2 decades, from 1898 to 1922, she preserved Waddesdon exactly as it was, treating it as something to be protected, not transformed. Its power did not grow, but it did not disappear either. When Alice died in 1922, Waddesdon passed to her son, James de Rothschild. James did not create Waddesdon. He did not use it to assert social dominance. His role was custodial, to keep the house alive in a century that was changing rapidly. James watched the old structures of power erode. The financial crash of 1929, rising property and inheritance taxes, the return of anti-Semitism across Europe, and finally, the outbreak of war in 1939. During those years, Waddesdon was no longer a tool of influence. It became an asset that needed to be hidden and protected. After 1945, a new pressure emerged. Britain entered a period of reconstruction. Government authority expanded. Inheritance taxes and estate duties increased sharply. In some cases, estate duty alone reached up to 65% for large private properties. Keeping Waddesdon was no longer a question of tradition or prestige, but a brutal financial equation. This is where another figure moved to the center of the story. Dorothy de Rothschild, James's wife. Dorothy was not the legal heir. Her name did not appear in the will. James, but she was the person facing post-war reality directly. Dorothy was British. She understood British society, public opinion, and the country's emerging system of heritage preservation. She saw something clearly. In the post-war world, power no longer came from ownership, but from being allowed to exist by society. Waddesdon now faced 3 simultaneous pressures. The cost of maintaining a mansion with hundreds of rooms, formal gardens, greenhouses, and a museum-level art collection still ran into tens of thousands of pounds per year, the equivalent of millions of dollars today. Public sentiment was shifting as Britain struggled with housing shortages and rationing, and patience for vast private estates was running out. And finally, the question of meaning. What purpose did Waddesdon serve in a society trying to dismantle the old order? Dorothy understood that keeping Waddesdon as a purely family asset would only delay its decline. Selling it would erase its historical significance entirely. She chose a third path. In the late 1942s, Dorothy began working with the National Trust. The National Trust is Britain's heritage organization responsible for preserving historically significant sites for public access. Transferring Waddesdon from a private family possession to a public heritage property was not an act of surrender. It was a transformation of power. A mansion built to prove the legitimacy of one family now opened its doors to society. Rooms once reserved for political and social elites became spaces for the public. Power no longer operated quietly behind closed doors. It was frozen into lawful memory. James remained the legal heir on paper. But Dorothy made the decision, not because she held more authority, but because she understood that the old form of power could not survive unchanged. Waddesdon was preserved, not as a fortress, not as a center of influence, but as a living record of how power is built and how it must change in order not to disappear. When old money is forced to become legitimate, by the late 1940s, Waddesdon Manor opened its doors to the public. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was the result of pressure from reality. After the war, Britain faced a severe housing crisis. More than 750,000 homes had been destroyed or damaged. Public resentment grew toward private estates, spanning hundreds of acres that served only a single family. In that climate, a place like Waddesdon was no longer viewed with admiration, but with a blunt question: what purpose does it serve? At this point, Waddesdon covered roughly 2,700 acres, with the main house alone containing over 100 rooms, not counting formal gardens, greenhouses, stables, wine cellars, and extensive service infrastructure. Annual maintenance costs still ran at levels equivalent to several $1,000,000 today, while Britain was entering the welfare state era, prioritizing housing, healthcare, and mass education. Waddesdon's existence became a social conflict. The National Trust's involvement was not simply about preserving beauty. It imposed a new set of rules. The house could no longer be closed at will. There were no longer spaces reserved solely for family use. Opening schedules, visitor routes, and interpretive content were required to serve the public, not a lineage. Private power was converted into license power. For the Rothschild family, this shift carried moral weight. For nearly a century, Waddesdon had been built to control who was allowed inside, who sat at the table, and who participated in consequential conversations. Now, anyone could enter. No invitation required, no family name, no pedigree, only a ticket. This transition was not entirely smooth. In the early years of public access, members of the old elite expressed quiet irritation. Some, former regular guests, did not accept sharing corridors with ordinary visitors. There were discreet complaints that Waddesdon had lost its character. But the real question was, whose character? A quieter turning point came in the early 1950s. The archives began to be systematically cataloged. Ledgers, correspondence, contracts, and servant employment records were reviewed for the first time as historical material. This introduced a new kind of risk, not to the building, but to the image of old money itself. Stories long ignored now had the potential to surface. Who worked here? How much they were paid? Who was dismissed? And for what reasons? Old money was accustomed to being viewed from a distance. Now it was being examined up close. Waddesdon shifted from a symbol of power to a living historical document. And this was the most profound reversal. A mansion built to control the narrative became a place where others were allowed to ask questions. Not questions of architecture or taste, but questions about how power is created and maintained. James de Rothschild died in 1957. By that point, the family's role at Waddesdon was no longer one of absolute ownership. They became patrons, custodians of memory, no longer operators of influence. Waddesdon continued to exist, but it no longer existed for one family alone. And this was the final paradox of old money. To survive, it was forced to abandon the very form of power that had created it. When the story gets simplified, in the early 1960s, Waddesdon Manor entered a new phase. It was no longer presented as a symbol of financial or political power, but as a cultural and aesthetic destination. Promotional materials focused on French architecture, Versailles-style gardens, 18th-century porcelain, paintings, and interiors. The reason the house existed quietly disappeared from the main narrative. Visitor numbers rose quickly. By the late 1960s, Waddesdon welcomed over 200,000 visitors per year, a remarkable figure for an estate outside London. The house began to be seen as a beautiful image of old money. This is where the tension emerged. To appeal to a mass audience, the story had to be simplified. The comfortable parts were kept. The uncomfortable parts were left out. Servant records did not appear on the main tours. Documents about dismissals and labor hierarchy remained in the archives. The Rothschild role in wartime finance was considered too sensitive for visitor-facing narratives. Nothing was false, but much was left unsaid. In the late 1970s, an internal conflict surfaced. A group of younger curators and historians asked, was Waddesdon an art museum or evidence of a power system? If only the beautiful story was told, was old money being made to look harmless? This was not a public scandal. No headlines, no press coverage. But inside the institution, the narrative began to fracture. The outcome was a compromise. Waddesdon did not rewrite its entire story, but it began to add secondary layers. Special exhibitions on servants, scholarly publications alongside tourist brochures, more complex history placed outside the main visitor flow. From this point on, Waddesdon was no longer just a tourist site. It became a place where history was selectively shaped, between beauty and truth, between pleasant experience and the responsibility to remember. Old money no longer operated through power, it operated through image. And that was the most dangerous transformation of all. Waddesdon Manor is still standing, intact, elegant, almost unchanged. But what has changed is not the walls. It is how we look at them. A place once built to control who could enter, who sat at the table, and who took part in consequential decisions, is now open to everyone. No closed-door agreements, no direct power, only images and memory. But power rarely disappears completely. It simply learns how to exist in another form. Today, Waddesdon does not command. It seduces. It invites admiration, desire, and acceptance, without demanding too many questions. That may be the most enduring legacy of old money, not assets, not banks, but the ability to shape how an era perceives wealth. This story still matters, because it is not about one family, but about how power adapts when the world changes. If great estates no longer rule through authority, but through image, are we living in a time that has moved beyond old money, or simply learned to live alongside it in a more refined way? On the screen now are other stories about estates, dynasties, and hidden layers of power that shape the modern world in ways we rarely notice. If you feel this story still left something unsaid, the next videos go even deeper. Thank you for watching until the end. Thanks for watching. I have an NCN. If this story gave you something to think about, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Well, see you again in the next story.